I'm Aaron Mate, sitting in for Jimmy Dore, and joining me now is Norman Finkelstein. He is an author and scholar, well known for his work on Israel-Palestine, has just written a new book called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. Norman Finkelstein, welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I didn't realize Jimmy Dore was so young.
Well, I'm sitting in for his place. I'm sitting in his place while he's out getting a well-deserved rest, and he'll be back in about a week on the Jimmy Dore Show. So, Norman, we're going to talk about your book in a second, but first I wanted to get your reaction to some political news. Here is the headline from Associated Press. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont said he would forego another presidential bid of his own and instead endorse President Biden's reelection. He told the Associated Press he would do everything I can to see that the president is reelected. That's Bernie Sanders, already jumping on board for Biden in 2024. Here's more. The last thing this country needs is a Donald Trump or some other right-wing demagogue who is going to try to undermine American democracy or take away a woman's right to choose or not address the crisis of gun violence or racism, sexism, or homophobia, Sanders said. So I'm in to do what I can to make sure the president is reelected. And this is more from the AP. Sanders' decision suggests that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Sanders' decision suggests that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will ultimately unify behind Biden's 2024 bid, even if progressives aren't excited about him. And Bernie Sanders goes on, people will do what they want to do, Bernie said of other primary challengers like RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson. I think Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee, and my job, and I think the progressive movement's job, is to make certain that he stands up and fights for the working class of this country and does not take anything for granted. And joining him in endorsing Biden already is Ilhan Omar of the Squad.
Be leading those negotiations. He is also, as we know, running for president again. Are progressives excited about that?
I mean, the reality is, in the last 2 years, under the slimmest majority in the House and in the Senate, we've been able to do incredible things by passing bills like the CHIPS Act or the Infrastructure Bill or the Inflation Reduction Act. The president was in my district celebrating some of that work earlier this month. He has been a real partner in listening to us when we've said we need movement in regards to addressing the climate crisis. We need movement in addressing student debt cancellation. And I think it is really important for us to support him for re-election. We are at this moment dealing with fascism. In this moment, we are dealing with people who don't actually believe democracy is good. We are dealing with people who are proposing the kind of economically devastating and dangerous bill that we just talked about. I don't think we have the opportunity to have the kind of conversations that people want to have. This is a very dangerous moment for our country, and the president that's leading us has done a great job, and we need to coalesce behind him.
So that's Ilhan Omar saying we don't have the opportunity right now to have the conversations we want to have about things like Medicare for all because of the danger of fascism in this country. And so accordingly, Biden's done a good job and we have to coalesce behind him. That's Ilhan Omar, a member of the Squad. Let's bring in our guest, Norman Finkelstein. Norman, you volunteered for the Bernie campaign. You knocked on doors as part of his candidacy to try to secure him the nomination. What do you make of all these progressives already, really with not even a primary being held yet, and Biden just announcing his reelection, all of them lining up to endorse him already?
Well, the first thing I would note is it's very striking in Bernie's statement, as you quoted it, that he's replaced his entire class platform with an identity politics platform, with the exception of mentioning gun violence. The old Bernie Sanders, in that first sentence, would have said that we're going to fight for Medicare for all, we're going to fight for a $15 minimum wage, we'll be fighting for a Green New Deal. That was Bernie Sanders' platform in 2016 and 2020. He's ditched that entire platform and replaced it with identity politics. That to me is deeply lamentable. And it's not something that people are going to rally behind. If he thinks he's going to bring out young people with that platform, I think he's fooling himself. Putting that aside for a moment, which is not trivial, but I'm mentioning it to move on. Ilhan Omar's statement, she says, now is not the time. We're living in dangerous times. Now, I agree with her on that point. We are living in dangerous times. I think we're living in very dangerous times. We've lived through, so far, we have survived the debacle of Ukraine, a provoked war by the US and NATO, into which the United States went pretty far close to the precipice of causing a nuclear war. Whether we're still going to survive it, I can't say because I don't know where things will head. There are important developments going on, but I'll leave that aside also for a moment. We're living in dangerous times. What are those dangerous times? In my opinion, of the three critical issues facing your generation, namely climate change, nuclear war, and a economy that's not functioning for about 80% of Americans. Of those three dangers confronting humankind right now in general, in the US in particular, the main danger is the danger of nuclear war. Now, it's very obvious if you read the press, if you follow statements in academic arenas, that the United States, under President Biden, is gearing up for a war with China. I just today received an invitation from what you might call a prestigious forum in the UK. And it's about the issue of war and peace. And I'll just read to you one paragraph, if you'll allow me. It says, for 3 generations, despite localized and sometimes extensive conflict, the world as a whole has avoided global war and maintained a remarkable peace. But the horizon is darkening rapidly. War in Europe, for decades unthinkable, shows no sign of ending and has the potential to escalate. While China-US relations deteriorate, with Xi Jinping instructing the generals to dare to fight, strengthen their military in preparation for war, and not to renounce the use of force over Taiwan. Well, as you could see from that description, 2 things are going on. Number one, and this is a warning to your generation, a world war is looming. And number 2, this war is being cast in the West as being provoked by China. Now, there is no question that the Biden administration has been instrumental in gearing up and provoking the war. Let's not forget, first, it was Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, for which to date, no explanation has been given. And then after that was Kevin McCarthy's trip to Taiwan. Yes, the horizon is darkening.
Yeah, Norman. And Kevin McCarthy even compared China and Russia and Iran to the Axis powers in the Second World War. He even invoked that. So that's another hint of that Washington wants war, if you're trying to draw these World War II analogies.
Well, that was also the analogy, by the way, if you remember with George Bush Jr., the axis of evil
Sure. Yeah.
was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
Yep.
So here's my question to Ilhan Omar. You say we live in dangerous times. We can't take risks now. I think electing Biden, backing Biden now, without even giving another person an opportunity to speak to these issues, to back him now, I would say is probably, I don't want to predict what a Trump presidency would be like in these circumstances with the war looming in China. He's a wild card, hard to predict which way he'll go. I'm sorry to say it's very predictable which way a Biden-Blinken administration would go. So I agree, we live in dangerous times. And I would say that's exactly why we can't afford a second Biden administration based on the track record of the first Biden administration.
Right. Norman, let me ask you to talk about this phenomenon where you have progressives like Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar, and they, at home, they talk about Medicare for all and standing up for workers and all the right progressive things. But once you cross U.S. borders, you leave the U.S. And you go to foreign policy, all of a sudden they're in lockstep with Biden. They're in lockstep with the neocons, as we've seen in Ukraine, all of them voting every time for these proxy war bills. Bernie even said recently that he trusts Biden on Ukraine. So talk to us about this phenomenon where for some reason all these progressive values that are championed at home, they're discarded once we leave U.S. boundaries.
Well, there are two things to be said about that. Number one, it's because the Democratic Party under the Biden administration, I'm just going to speak for the Biden administration now, has become a totalitarian institution where it doesn't brook any dissent. So everybody is fearful that if they criticize Biden on Ukraine, and I'm not talking about condemning Biden's policy, I'm not talking about supporting Russia in the war, I'm just talking about even expressing the mildest criticism in this totalitarian system that the Democratic Party has erected. It won't tolerate any criticism whatsoever of the great leader. Now, that wasn't the case in the past. You could think of every war the United States has fought. There has been within the Democratic Party not many, at least not the beginning, not many dissenters, but there are always honorable dissenters. That's not the case now with the Democratic Party. It's a totalitarian institution in which people like Bernie Sanders, who I have to believe that in the privacy of his mind, recognizes there are certain things Biden is doing in the Ukraine that are problematic at the very least. But he recognizes the price for voicing any criticism, even the mildest, is that he's going to come under severe attack. Number two, on the domestic front, it's a very striking thing. I've spent the last few months rereading the classic works on the left regarding the rise of fascism in Germany, the Spanish Civil War, and also the build-up to World War I. And it's a very striking fact that if you read people like the Russian revolutionist Leon Trotsky, when he's chronicling the rise of the Nazis to power, he's not attacking the Nazis. He's constantly attacking the social or called social democratic, we would call it now more or less Democratic Party, the Democratic Party or Social Democratic Party left. Why was he doing that? Because he said that unless you articulate a real working class platform, you're going to lose the working class. They're going to defect to the Nazis. They're going to defect to, now we would call it, to Hitler's party. Why do I bring that up? I have some very close young people who I talk about on this issue. And they're very critical of yourself. They're critical of Jimmy Dore. They're critical of Brianna Joy Gray. They're critical of Crystal Ball. And they say, why are they always attacking the Democratic Party? Why aren't they attacking the Republicans? Why aren't they attacking the Republicans? And on its surface, it seemed like a valid criticism. But then I was struck by the fact that if you don't, now to extrapolate from Trotsky, if you don't want a fascist victory in this country, and that's a problem, it's real, we shouldn't deny it. If you don't want a fascist victory in this country, that's all the more reason you should be attacking the platform of the Democratic Party, from which the working class base is going to bleed over to the Republicans, to the Trump wing of the Republicans. So if my point is, if you really don't want a fascist victory here, then that's all the more reason you should be attacking the Democratic Party for its failure to deliver to its working class constituents and to prevent the bleeding over into the Republican Party. Bernie, as I said a few moments ago, and since time is precious, I don't want to repeat myself, Bernie has to be kidding himself if he believes that platform, which he announced in the first paragraph of the statement you read, if he thinks that's going to bring out people to vote for the Democratic Party. It'll bring out some identity politics folks. It'll bring out some women who are concerned about the abortion issue. But if you think you're going to get beyond that with that kind of politics, well, you're either living in a fool's world or you're deluding yourself. It's not going to happen. It's simply handing on a silver platter the election to Donald Trump or DeSantis, whoever turns out to be the Republican nominee for president. It's so easy to imagine what's going to happen if and when that debate comes to pass. Trump is going to pile on Biden for that war in the Ukraine, the $100 billion. What did you get for it? If I had been president, I wouldn't have had a war in the Ukraine. And Biden's going to say, well, how are you going to? I know how to talk to Putin. It wouldn't have happened. It's going to be a complete disaster. That's incidentally why now, if you read the news carefully, or even not so carefully, even cursorily, the United States is trying to bail out on Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because they know there are two reasons, in my opinion. Do you mind if we switch to that topic, or you want to continue on the topic you just asked me on?
Well, we're going to wrap this segment, and we can talk more about Ukraine shortly. Well, why don't you quickly tell us your points, actually? The two reasons why why the U.S. is bailing out on Ukraine. Go ahead.
Okay. The two reasons are, number one, it's turned into the worst diplomatic or foreign policy debacle of the United States since the Iraq War. The immediate purpose, I don't want to go back 30 years, but the immediate purpose of the Ukraine war was part of a grand strategy to try to line up the pieces on what's called, the grand chessboard for that war with China. Well, what was the result of that undertaking by the United States? Before you knew it, China had pulled the rug from out under the United States with regard to Saudi Arabia and Iran. Then you had Macron, the French president, breaking ranks and going over to China. Then you had Lula, the president of Brazil, going over to China. Then you had German automakers saying, we're not giving up on the Chinese market. There are 1 billion people in China, and now the automobile in China is like the automobile was in the United States in the 1920s. It's the status symbol, and every Chinese wants a car. So for German automakers, that means 1 billion cars. They're not giving up that market. So where does that leave us? As the United States prepares for its war with China, it seems like its only ally is going to be Poland. If you look at the way the pieces are now located on the chessboard. So number one, this has been a complete disaster for the United States. And number two, there's the problem of the election. How is Biden going to cope with Trump's attacks with regard to what happened in the Ukraine? So a diplomatic debacle, an albatross for the presidential race. So the United States is engaging what I call the cruelest and most cynical maneuver humanly imaginable. That is to say, it's telling Ukraine, we'll give you one more chance, the so-called spring offensive.
Right.
And if you don't make it in the spring offensive, then it's game over. Well, half of the coverage is saying Ukraine has one last chance, the spring offensive, and the other half is saying nothing can come of that offensive. There's no way Ukraine can recover significant ground in the Ukraine, so nothing is going to come of it. So what does that leave you with? The United States is hurling, Hurling, hurling Ukraine youth into a murderous war which they can't win. Everybody seems to be saying that here. You can't win that spring offensive. You can't win so as to give the United States a face-saving way out. So the U.S. could say, we gave them, we tried, but it didn't succeed. So we did the honorable thing, but now we have to move on, and Ukraine has to settle the war.
Right. And the one time when progressives called on Biden to use the extensive U.S. leverage to negotiate an end to this war, they retracted that within 24 hours because, as you were talking about, these authoritarian tendencies that cannot tolerate any criticism sprung into action, shamed these progressives, and got them to cave within 24 hours. And that's where we're at. And the same sort of dynamics are now getting all these progressives to endorse Biden before even he faces a challenger in the primary. And one of them, so we've heard from Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar. Now AOC also coming forward to endorse Biden.
You back Biden in 2024 if he even asked you to be a potential surrogate because you do know how to rally, young people, mobilize them?
I unequivocally support our Democratic nominees. There is no question about that. The risks that our democracy are at right now are far too high. The President and I have our differences, but I think at the end of the day, we're very united in preventing the horrors of what re-electing Donald Trump or even someone like Ron DeSantis would pose to the country.
So that's AOC also coming forward to endorse Biden. And Wall Street is not wasting any time. Here's a headline from the Financial Times. Joe Biden urges Wall Street donors to fill $1 billion plus campaign war chest. And within a few days of Biden's announcement, already there's fundraisers with Wall Street being held in Washington. And here's Yanis Varoufakis. When you ask Wall Street for a cool $1 billion to fund your election campaign, you have already lost the last iota of any smidgen of the mere possibility of governing for the people. But yet the progressives elected to Congress on a platform of governing for the people, they're already leaping forward, just like Wall Street, to endorse Joe Biden.
We're telling jokes in Nashville, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, Connecticut, Baltimore, Chicago, Rosemont, San Diego, and more. Go to jimmydore.com to get a link for all those tickets. Plus, you can watch my new special, COVID Lies Are Funny.